Hi, I'm Jamey from Stonemeyer Games, and I'm here today to talk about my favorite game mechanism it's called the Fantasy Trivia League. I stumble over that term because I'm not actually in this league. I don't really like trivia. Um, but a few friends of mine love trivia, and they're in this fantasy league that has a really interesting game mechanism that I thought would be interesting to talk about to my fellow board game designers. They're in this league where they're matched up. So it's like fantasy sports where you're matched up head to head with one other player essentially week to week, and you're competing against them. And in this fantasy league, which apparently has grown quite big at this point, um, everyone in the world who's in the league gets the same questions every week. They all get the same questions, and they kind of are on this honor system that they won't Google the answers. And you're matched up head to head with a person within your league, and both of you try to answer the questions correctly, which is fine. That's not the interesting mechanism. The interesting mechanism that happens is that when you get the questions, but before you actually answer them, or I think it maybe happens during the week, like you can do it at any time um, before you actually submit the answers. You not only answer the questions, but you also assign points to your opponent's questions. And remember, you have the same questions, but they're in a variety of categories. And you get to see the opponent's kind of their statistics for answering questions in different categories. So, for example, say there's one music question in the set of questions that you get this week. Um, and you have, I think you have a set number of points to disperse. So you have to assign, I think it's either 0, 1, 2, maybe 3 points per question. Um, and you can't give them all zeros. It has to add up to a certain amount. And so there's one question in the music category, and you can see that the person has answered in the past. They've answered like 59% of music questions correctly. So you might assign that one question a point value of maybe 1 or 2, somewhere in the middle. You also might see that they've answered like only 10% of the entertainment question correctly. And so knowing or thinking that they might get that wrong, there's a good chance of them getting it wrong. You might assign them a 3, like the most points that they could possibly get for that question, thinking that they won't get any points at all because they're not going to get it right. That's the gist of it. I think this is really interesting as it applies to board games when you're scoring in different categories at the end of the game. If somehow during the game you could assign your opponent or one of your opponents, it could either be in a two-person game or in a larger group game, you could assign like the player to your left. You could assign the points that they would score for a certain category. So say at the end of the game you score for number of gold tokens that someone has. Uh, and you could say, okay, you're going to get 1 point per gold token, and maybe someone else who recognizes that you're not good at getting gold would assign you 3 points per gold token, and you would score that at the end of the game. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking, you don't have the track record built up that you do in the fantasy trivia league. So before the game, I couldn't look at someone across the table and say they're not going to be good at accumulating gold in this game. So maybe this would have to happen like midway through the game, or it would happen based on an asymmetric role that player has. So you might see, okay, their role makes them really not good at scoring in a certain category. I'll give them the maximum points for that category. And that way, that player has the option of breaking away from their predetermined asymmetric role, thinking that they might get assigned more points for that role, and kind of building an engine around being able to get those points. But they're doing it without knowing for sure how many points they're going to get from it. In a game like this, you probably wouldn't ever want to give someone 0 points. In fact, that's probably not the case in the Fantasy Trivia League. The minimum is probably 1, because you never want a player to work towards something and then get nothing for doing so. Um, but so you could do like 1, 2, or 3 points. But I just think that's an interesting like extra layer to a game that's not all that complex. But just to have to think ahead at some point in the game and assign another player points for how they think how they're going to score at the end, and how that player has to try to figure out a little bit of how you assigned points to them. I think this would work particularly well in a head-to-head game, kind of like the Fantasy Trivia League, where it's just you against one other player, and at some point during the game, you're assigning those secret category scoring points. Anyway, I mentioned this partially because I'm interested in the idea, and partially because there might be a game out there that already does this, where players can assign points to other players that they discover at the end of the game. Let me know if you know of any games like that in the comments. Thanks.